She had stopped counting birthdays after 45, when the last marriage proposal dried up like autumn leaves in her untended garden. Margaret Eleanor Hartwell lived in a house that creaked with secrets and settled with sighs, perched on the edge of Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, where the prairie stretched endlessly toward horizons that never seemed to get any closer. At 53, she had resigned herself to being the town's cautionary tale, the woman who had waited too long, asked for too much, and ended up with nothing but a mortgage and memories of what might have been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But sometimes fate rides into town on horseback, wearing worn leather chaps and carrying hope in calloused hands. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a 28-year-old cowboy named Samuel James McKinnon, who looked at her weathered hands and saw stories worth hearing, who noticed the way sunlight caught the silver threads in her auburn hair and called it beautiful. The morning fog hung thick over the Flint Hills, rolling across the grassland like a gray blanket someone had forgotten to fold. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, steam from her coffee mug creating small circles of condensation on the glass as she watched the sun struggle to break through the haze. The ritual never changed: black coffee, no sugar, in the same chipped blue mug her mother had given her 20 years ago. The silence in the house wasn't companionable anymore. It pressed against her eardrums like cotton wool, thick and suffocating. Her cottage sat 3 miles outside Cottonwood Falls proper, close enough to hear the church bells on Sunday mornings, but far enough away that she could pretend not to notice. When the congregation gathered for socials, she was never invited to anymore. The isolation hadn't been intentional at first. When she'd inherited the property from her grandmother at 32, it had seemed like a sanctuary, a place where she could write her novels in peace, tend her garden, and wait for the right man to find her. 21 years later, the novels remained unfinished manuscripts stacked in boxes. The garden had surrendered to weeds except for a stubborn patch of tomatoes, and the right man had apparently taken a detour that led him past her door entirely. Margaret had been beautiful once, or so people told her. Not in the delicate porcelain way that made men write poetry, but in the sturdy, wholesome way that suggested she could bear healthy children and keep a clean house. Her hair had been the color of copper pennies, her figure full and womanly, her laugh infectious enough to fill a room. But beauty, she had learned, was a depreciating asset, and she had spent too many years believing that her worth lay in her potential rather than her substance. The ladies at the Mercantile still spoke to her, of course, but their conversations had shifted over the years from inquiries about suitors to well-meaning advice about accepting spinsterhood with grace. "Some women are meant for marriage, Margaret dear," Mrs. Abernathy had said just last month while weighing out flour. "And some are meant for ... other things." The pause before other things had hung in the air like a judgment, leaving Margaret to wonder what exactly those other things might be. She finished her coffee and set the mug in the sink, noting how the morning light revealed the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny ghosts. The house felt too large around her, filled with furniture meant for a family that had never materialized. The dining room table could seat 8 but hadn't hosted a meal for more than one in over a decade. The spare bedrooms remained perpetually ready for guests who never came, their beds made with quilts her grandmother had stitched by hand. The day stretched ahead of her like an empty page, waiting to be filled with the same routine that had sustained her for years, but no longer satisfied her. She would tend to the tomatoes, perhaps attempt another chapter of the novel she'd been writing for 5 years, prepare a simple lunch for one, and spend the afternoon reading on the front porch if the weather held. By evening, she would have exchanged perhaps a dozen words with the mailman and possibly a nod with the neighbor, who lived a quarter-mile down the road. Margaret pulled on her gardening gloves and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp September air that carried the scent of approaching autumn. The tomato plants drooped heavy with fruit, their vines sprawling in every direction despite her attempts to stake them properly. She had planted too many again this year, just as she did every year, somehow hoping that abundance in the garden might compensate for scarcity elsewhere in her life. As she knelt among the plants, pulling weeds with more force than necessary, Margaret allowed herself to remember the last time a man had looked at her with genuine interest. It had been 3 years ago at the county fair. A widower named Harold Pembroke, who ran the feed store in Council Grove. He had tipped his hat to her at the pie contest, complimented her apple cranberry entry, and even asked if he might call on her sometime. For 2 weeks, Margaret had found herself humming while she worked, imagining conversations they might have, meals they might share, but Harold Pembroke had never called, and she later learned from Mrs. Abernathy that he had started courting a widow from Emporia, a woman 5 years younger than Margaret, with 3 grown children and a reputation for excellent Sunday dinners. The rejection hadn't surprised her, but it had settled something cold and final in her chest. Like the last nail in a coffin she hadn't realized she was building. The morning passed slowly as Margaret worked in her garden, her movements automatic and practiced. She filled 2 baskets with tomatoes, knowing she would spend the afternoon canning them into sauce she would never finish eating. The excess would go to the church charity drive, anonymously left on the steps after dark so she wouldn't have to endure the pitying smiles of the congregation. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy precision, and Margaret envied its freedom. She imagined what it would be like to soar above the endless grassland, to see the world spread out below like a patchwork quilt, to go wherever. The wind carried her without explanation or apology. Instead, she was earthbound, rooted to this place by habit and fear in equal measure. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road broke through her reverie, causing her to look up from the tomato plants with dirt-stained gloves shielding her eyes from the sun. A lone rider approached at an easy pace, his horse's gait steady and unhurried. Margaret's heart quickened slightly. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, and she couldn't make out the rider's identity from this distance. As the horse and rider drew closer, Margaret found herself standing and brushing the dirt from her apron, an automatic gesture born of a lifetime of her mother's training about proper appearances. The rider was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges where it met his collar. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, his body moving in rhythm with the animal's gait as if they were extensions of each other. The horse was a beautiful bay mare, well cared for but showing the honest wear of hard work. Her coat gleamed in the morning sun, and her eyes were alert and intelligent. Margaret had always been good with horses. Her father had taught her to ride before she could properly walk, and she could appreciate the quality of both animal and horsemanship before her. The young man guided his horse through the open gate of Margaret's property with the politeness of someone who understood rural etiquette. He didn't presume to approach the house directly, but stopped at a respectful distance, touching the brim of his worn felt hat in greeting. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Name's Samuel McKinnon." His accent held traces of Texas, softened by time and travel, but still distinctive in the way he shaped his vowels. Margaret found herself smoothing her hair self-consciously, aware that she must look every one of her 53 years in the harsh morning light. "Good morning," she replied, surprised by how rusty her voice sounded from disuse. "I'm Margaret Hartwell. What can I do for you, Mr. McKinnon?" Samuel dismounted with fluid grace, keeping his horse's reins loose in his hand. "I was riding through, heading toward Emporia for work, and my horse picked up a stone in her shoe about a mile back. I was wondering if you might have a pick I could borrow, or if you'd mind me using your well to give her some water while I tend to her." The request was reasonable and politely made, the kind of neighborly assistance that was common in rural areas where help might be hours away. But Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness she hadn't experienced in years. When was the last time a man, any man, let alone one this young and undeniably handsome, had stood in her yard asking for her help? Of course, she heard herself saying. The well's just there by the barn, and I believe there's a hoof pick in the tack room. Please, help yourself. Samuel's smile transformed his entire face, crinkling the corners of his green eyes and revealing teeth that were slightly crooked but undeniably charming. Much obliged, Miss Hartwell. I promise we won't be in any trouble, Miss Hartwell. Not Mrs., which would have been presumptuous, but Miss, which somehow managed to sound respectful rather than pointed. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned quickly back to her tomatoes, hoping to hide her reaction. She listened to the sound of Samuel's boots on the packed earth as he led his horse toward the well, the soft murmur of his voice as he spoke to the animal. There was something infinitely soothing about the presence of another person in her space, even a stranger passing through. The yard felt more alive somehow, charged with possibility in a way it hadn't in months. Margaret tried to focus on her gardening, but she found herself stealing glances at Samuel as he worked. He moved with the efficient economy of motion that spoke of experience, lifting his horse's hoof and examining it carefully before selecting the right tool. His hands were gentle but sure as he worked the stone free, murmuring praise to the mare when she stood patiently for his ministrations. There we go, sweetheart, she heard him say to the horse. That's got to feel better. The endearment, casual and natural as breathing, sent an unexpected pang through Margaret's chest. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her with such unconscious tenderness? When was the last time she had been called sweetheart, even in passing? Samuel led the horse to the water trough, allowing her to drink while he checked her other hooves for stones or signs of tenderness. The morning sun caught the highlights in his hair, and Margaret noticed the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders as he bent to his task. She looked away quickly, ashamed of the direction her thoughts were taking. Beautiful garden you have there, Samuel called out, straightening from his examination of the horse. Those tomatoes look like they're having a good year. Margaret felt her cheeks warm again. Thank you. I'm afraid I always plant too many. I never seem to learn. My grandmother used to say there's no such thing as too many tomatoes, Samuel replied, walking closer to the garden fence with his horse following docilely behind him. She'd can sauce all summer and trade the extra jars for whatever else she needed. Said tomatoes were better than money because at least you could eat them if times got hard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Margaret said, finding herself relaxing slightly. There was something disarming about Samuel's easy manner, the way he spoke as if they were old friends rather than strangers who had met 5 minutes ago. She was that, Samuel agreed, his expression growing thoughtful. Raised me from the time I was 8, after my parents died in a fever outbreak. Taught me everything I know about horses, gardening, and treating people right. Been gone 3 years now, but I still hear her voice sometimes, telling me to mind manners and look for the good in folks. The casual revelation of loss, shared without self-pity or expectation of sympathy, struck Margaret as remarkably mature for someone so young. She found herself studying his face more closely, noting the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of time spent squinting into the sun, the calluses on his hands that testified to honest work. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. She must have been very special to you. She was, Samuel confirmed, then brightened. But she wouldn't want me standing around feeling sorry for myself when there's work to be done, and people too. Meat, he gestured toward the tomato plants. Would you mind if I asked what varieties you're growing? I'm always trying to learn from experienced gardeners. Experienced gardeners. Margaret felt a flush of pride at the designation, even as part Of her wondered if Samuel was simply being polite. "Mostly Cherokee purples and brandywines," she said, moving closer to the fence that separated them. "The Cherokee purples are heirloom. My grandmother grew them, and her grandmother before that. The seeds have been in my family for generations." Samuel's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Heirlooms are something special. All that history passed down from hand to hand, season to season. My grandmother had a bean variety that came from her great-grandmother in Virginia. Always said those beans carried the memory of better times." Margaret found herself smiling, the first genuine smile she had worn in weeks. "That's exactly how I feel about these tomatoes. Sometimes I think they grow better for me because they know they're home." "I believe that," Samuel said seriously. "Plants know when they're loved, just like people do. They respond to care and attention in ways that can't be measured or explained, only felt." The simple profundity of his words caught Margaret off guard. Here was a young cowboy, dusty from the road and probably without much formal education, expressing a truth she had felt but never articulated. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just his youth and good looks, but something deeper, a quality of thoughtfulness that was increasingly rare in a world that seemed to value speed over reflection. "Where did you learn such wisdom, Mr. McKinnon?" she asked, genuinely curious. Samuel's cheeks reddened slightly, and he ducked his head with endearing modesty. "Mostly from spending time alone with animals and growing things. They teach you to pay attention, to notice the small changes that matter. And my grandmother always said that if you listen more than you talk, you'll learn something new every day." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. When was the last time she had engaged in genuine conversation with another person? When was the last time someone had listened to her thoughts about gardening or family history with such apparent interest? "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Margaret said. "I would have liked to meet her." "She would have liked you too," Samuel replied without hesitation. "She always said the best people were the ones who understood that growing things and caring for animals was sacred work, whether anyone else recognized it or not." The phrase "sacred work" resonated through Margaret like a bell struck in a quiet cathedral. She had never thought of her solitary existence in such terms, but perhaps there was something to be said for the quiet devotion she had shown to her garden. Her house, her small corner of the world. Samuel glanced at the sun, which had climbed higher while they talked. "I should probably get moving if I want to reach Emporia by nightfall," he said with what sounded like reluctance. "Thank you kindly for the use of your well and tools, Miss Hartwell, and for the conversation. It's been a pleasure." Margaret felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving, of returning to the silence that would feel even more oppressive. Now that she had remembered what it was like to share her thoughts with another person. "Would you ... she began, then stopped, unsure of the propriety of what she was about to suggest. Samuel waited patiently, his green eyes encouraging. "Would you like some tomatoes to take with you?" She finished, the words coming out in a rush. "I have far more than I can use, and they travel well if you wrap them carefully." Samuel's face brightened considerably. "That's very generous of you, Miss Hartwell. I'd be honored to accept, if you're sure you can spare them." Margaret hurried to fill a small basket with her finest tomatoes, wrapping each one in newspaper to prevent bruising. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and she found herself taking longer than necessary with the task, reluctant to complete it and watch Samuel ride away. "These Cherokee purples are particularly good," she said, holding up a large, dark red fruit with shoulders that gleamed like garnets in the sunlight. "They're sweet enough to eat like apples, but they make excellent sauce too." Samuel accepted the basket with both hands, his fingers brushing hers briefly as he took it. The contact was electric, sending a shock of awareness up Margaret's arm that she hadn't felt in longer than she cared to remember. "I'll think of you in your garden every time I taste one," he said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it as more than a polite platitude. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks again. It's nothing really. I'm just glad they'll enjoy it rather than going to waste. Samuel secured the basket carefully to his saddle, then turned back to face her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the garden fence, and Margaret felt as if something important was happening, though she couldn't have said what. "Miss Hartwell," Samuel said finally, his voice softer than before. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but it seems to me that a woman who can grow tomatoes like these and speak about them with such love shouldn't be doing it alone." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so achingly true. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and looked away, struggling to maintain her composure. "I'm sorry," Samuel said quickly. "I didn't mean to overstep. It's just that, well, loneliness has a sound to it, and I recognize it because I've heard it in my own voice more times than I care to admit." Margaret looked back at him, surprised by his honesty. "You're lonely too?" Samuel nodded, his expression serious. "Working horses and cattle is solitary work. You can go days without speaking to another soul, weeks without having a real conversation. It changes you, makes you appreciate human connection in a way most people take for granted." "But you're so young," Margaret protested. "Surely there are plenty of women who would welcome your company." Samuel's smile was rueful. "Youth isn't always an advantage, Miss Hartwell, especially when you're a drifter without much to offer except honest work and a willing heart. Most women want security, stability, and a man who can provide for a family. I'm still figuring out how to provide for myself." Margaret felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name: sympathy, recognition, perhaps even protectiveness toward this young man who spoke so openly about his struggles. "You seem like a good man, Mr. McKinnon. I'm sure the right woman will see that when the time comes." "And you seem like a remarkable woman, Miss Hartwell," Samuel replied. "Any man worth having would count himself lucky to earn your affection." The compliment, simple and apparently sincere, took Margaret's breath away. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had called her remarkable, had suggested that her affection was something to be valued rather than pitied or dismissed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze. Samuel mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle as if he belonged there. "I hope our paths cross again sometime, Miss Hartwell. I'd like to hear how those Cherokee purples are doing next season." "I'd like that too," Margaret said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in years. Samuel touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then guided his horse toward the gate. Margaret watched him go, memorizing the straight line of his back, the easy way he sat his horse, the sound of hoofbeats growing fainter as he headed down the dirt road toward town. When he was finally out of sight, Margaret sank down onto her porch steps, feeling as if she had just awakened from a long dreamless sleep. The morning had started like any other, with coffee and silence and the weight of another empty day ahead. But something fundamental had shifted in the space of half an hour, something that made the world seem larger and more full of possibility than it had in years. She thought about Samuel's words, about loneliness having a sound, about plants knowing when they were loved, about sacred work and the value of listening more than speaking. She thought about the way he had looked at her, not with pity or dismissal, but with genuine interest and respect. She thought about his admission of his own loneliness, the vulnerability he'd shown in sharing his struggles with a stranger. Margaret rose from the steps and walked back to her garden, but the tomatoes seemed less important now than they had an hour ago. The silence that had oppressed her for so long felt different, somehow not empty but expectant, as if the world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. For the first time in years, Margaret Hartwell found herself looking forward to tomorrow, wondering if it might bring another visitor, another conversation, another glimpse of the life that might still be possible for a woman who had almost given up on hope. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. but she held onto it like a seed planted in fertile ground, waiting to see what might grow. The days following Samuel McKinnon's visit passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching like taffy in Margaret's increasingly restless mind. She found herself pausing in her daily tasks to stare down the empty road, listening for hoofbeats that never came. The Cherokee purple tomatoes seemed to mock her with their abundance, reminding her of the conversation that had awakened something in her chest she thought had died years ago. By Thursday, Margaret could no longer pretend that life had simply returned to normal. She caught herself humming while she swept the porch. When had she last hummed? And discovered she had been unconsciously improving her appearance each morning, braiding her graying auburn hair more carefully and choosing her better work dress instead of the faded calico she usually wore for gardening. The realization embarrassed and thrilled her in equal measure. At 53, was she really primping for a cowboy nearly half her age, who had probably forgotten her existence the moment he rode out of sight? Friday brought unexpected company in the form of Judith Carmichael, her nearest neighbor and the closest thing she had to a friend in Cottonwood Falls. Judith lived a quarter-mile down the road with her husband Ezra and their 2 youngest children. Still at home. At 48, she had the weathered look of a woman who had borne 7 children and buried 2. But her eyes remained kind despite the hardships that had carved lines around them. "Margaret, dear," Judith called as she approached the front porch, carrying a covered dish that smelled of cinnamon and apples. "I brought you some of that apple crisp you're always so kind about. Ezra said I made enough to feed half the county." Margaret set down her mending and rose to greet her neighbor, genuinely pleased to have company. Judith's visits were infrequent, but always welcome, bringing news from town and a respite from the endless silence that had begun to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. "How thoughtful of you," Margaret said, accepting the dish gratefully. "Would you like some coffee?" "I was just thinking how quiet the afternoon felt." Judith's sharp eyes studied Margaret's face with the practiced assessment of a woman who had learned to read subtleties in expression. "You look different somehow," she said as they settled into the wooden chairs on the porch. "Brighter, perhaps. Have you been feeling well?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with pouring coffee from the pot she had brought. "Outside. I'm quite well, thank you. Perhaps it's just the change in weather. September has always was my favorite month." Judith accepted her cup with a knowing smile. "In my experience, that particular kind of brightness in a woman's face usually has less to do with weather and more to do with company. Has someone been calling on you?" The question, asked with gentle curiosity rather than nosiness, caught Margaret off guard. She had forgotten how perceptive Judith could be, how those years of motherhood had taught her to notice the small changes that others might miss. "Not calling exactly," Margaret found herself saying. "A young cowboy stopped by earlier this week. His horse had picked up a stone, and he needed to use the well." Judith's eyebrows rose with interest. "A cowboy? How intriguing. Was he handsome?" "Judith!" Margaret protested, but she couldn't keep the smile from her voice. "He was simply a traveler, in need of assistance. It was nothing more than common courtesy." "Common courtesy doesn't put that particular flush in a woman's cheeks," Judith observed with obvious amusement. "Tell me about this young man. What was his name?" Margaret found herself describing Samuel McKinnon despite her intentions to change the subject. She told Judith about his gentle manner with his horse, his thoughtful conversation about gardening, his respectful demeanor and easy smile. As she spoke, she realized how much the brief encounter had meant to her, how it had illuminated the depth of her loneliness by offering a glimpse of what connection might feel like. "And how young is this paragon of cowboy virtue?" Judith asked when Margaret had finished her recitation. "I would guess perhaps 28 or 30, Margaret admitted reluctantly. Judith nearly choked on her coffee. 28? Margaret. Eleanor Hartwell, you old fool, what are you thinking? The words stung more than Margaret had expected, partly because they echoed her own internal criticism. "I'm not thinking anything improper," she said stiffly. "It was simply a pleasant conversation with a polite stranger. Nothing more." "Nothing more, my eye," Judith said, but her tone had softened. "Margaret, dear, I've known you for 15 years. I've never seen you light up the way you just did talking about anyone, let alone a man. But honey, he's young enough to be your son." "I'm aware of that," Margaret replied quietly. "Believe me, I'm quite aware of how ridiculous it would be for a woman my age to entertain any romantic notions about such a young man." Judith reached over and placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. "I didn't say it was ridiculous. I said it was complicated. There's a difference." Margaret looked up in surprise. "You think I'm not too old?" "I think age is more complex than most people want to admit," Judith said thoughtfully. "My own grandmother married a man 12 years younger when she was 45 and he was 33. Caused quite the scandal in their small town, but they were happy together for 27 years until she passed. He never remarried, said no other woman could compare to his Ellen." "That's different," Margaret protested. "Your grandmother was 45, not 53. And she was a widow with property and standing in the community. I'm just an old maid who grows too many tomatoes. You're a woman with a good heart, a quick mind, and more to offer than you give yourself credit for," Judith said firmly. "And from what you've told me, this young man saw something in you worth his time and attention. Perhaps you should trust his judgment rather than assuming he was simply being polite." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "But what if I'm misreading everything? What if I'm just a lonely old woman seeing romance where none exists? The humiliation would be unbearable. And what if you're not?" Judith countered. "What if he was as affected by your conversation as you were by his? What if he's thinking about you right now, wondering if he'll ever have reason to travel this way again?" The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Margaret had spent so many years protecting herself from disappointment that the idea of hope felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might not hold her weight. "Even if that were true," Margaret said slowly, "what future could there be in it? He's a young man with his whole life ahead of him. He should be looking for a young woman who can give him children, who can grow old alongside him rather than leaving him a widower while he's still in his prime." Judith was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard. "You know," she said finally, "my youngest sister Rachel always said she wanted a large family, a house full of children and grandchildren. She married young to a man who shared that dream, and they tried for 15 years to have babies. When she finally accepted that children weren't in God's plan for her, she was 42 and felt like her life was over." Margaret waited, sensing there was more to the story. "But then she met William at a church social, a widower with 3 grown children who had no interest in starting another family. He was 55 to her 42, and what they found together wasn't the dream either of them had started with. But it was good. It was real. They've been married 8 years now, and I've never seen Rachel happier." "What's your point?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew. "My point is that sometimes the best gifts come in packages we never thought to wish for," Judith said gently. "Maybe this young cowboy isn't looking for children and a traditional family. Maybe he's looking for understanding, for conversation, for someone who sees past his age to the man he actually is. And maybe you're exactly what he needs, just as he might be exactly what you need." Margaret absorbed this in silence, feeling something shift in her chest like a key turning in a long locked door. For years, she had defined herself by what she lacked: husband, children, youth, conventional beauty. But what if she had been approaching the question from the wrong angle? What if, instead of cataloging her deficiencies, she considered what she might have to offer? "I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way," she admitted. "Most of us don't," Judith said with a smile. We're so busy worrying about what we're not that we forget to value what we are. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. Margaret found herself thinking about Samuel's words regarding sacred work, about his grandmother's wisdom regarding listening more than speaking. Perhaps there was something to be said for the quiet strength she had developed during her years of solitude, the self-reliance and contentment she had cultivated in her garden and her books. Judith, Margaret said suddenly, what do people in town say about me? Her neighbor considered the question carefully. Honestly, most folks respect you. They think you're a bit odd for choosing to live alone out here, but they admire your independence. Mrs. Patterson always speaks highly of your preserves at the church charity drives. The Hendersons still talk about how you helped deliver their youngest when the doctor couldn't get through during that terrible snowstorm 3 years ago. And everyone knows you could have sold this property years ago for a tidy profit, but chose to stay and maintain it the way your grandmother would have wanted. Margaret felt a flush of pride she hadn't experienced in years. She had forgotten about young Timothy Henderson's birth, the way she had stayed with Grace Henderson for 16 hours, coaching her through labor when the storm made travel impossible. She had forgotten about the dozens of jars of preserves she had quietly donated over the years, the times she had helped neighbors without fanfare or expectation of recognition. I suppose I do have value beyond my marital status, she said slowly. More than you know, Judith confirmed. And any man with sense would see that, regardless of his age. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the direction of the main road. Both women turned to look, and Margaret felt her heart begin to race when she recognized the familiar figure of Samuel McKeenan approaching on his baymar. Well, Judith murmured with obvious amusement, speak of the devil. Samuel drew closer, and Margaret could see that he carried a large bundle tied to his saddle. His face brightened when he spotted the two women on the porch, and he guided his horse through the gate with the same respectful manner he had shown before. Good afternoon, Miss Hartwell, he called, touching the brim of his hat. I hope I'm not intruding. I brought you something. Margaret's mouth had gone dry, but she managed to find her voice. Good afternoon, Mr. McKinnon. You're not intruding at all. This is my neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael. Samuel dismounted and approached the porch, nodding politely to Judith. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Likewise, Judith replied, her eyes sparkling with barely contained mirth. Margaret was just telling me about your previous visit. Margaret shot her neighbor a warning look, but Judith's expression remained innocently neutral. I hope she mentioned how generous she was with her tomatoes, Samuel said, his smile warm as he looked at Margaret. I've been thinking about them for days. Best I ever tasted. That's very kind of you to say, Margaret replied, acutely aware of Judith's interested gaze. What brings you back to Cottonwood Falls? Samuel untied the bundle from his saddle and approached the porch steps. Well, I had some business in Emporia, but it finished up sooner than expected. And I found something in town that I thought you might appreciate. He held out the bundle, which Margaret now saw was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It's not much, but when I saw it, I thought of our conversation about heirloom seeds and family traditions. Margaret accepted the package with trembling hands, very aware of the way Samuel's fingers brushed hers during the exchange. She untied the string carefully and folded back the paper to reveal a small wooden box, obviously handmade and polished to a warm glow. It's a seed box, Samuel explained, his voice slightly nervous. The craftsman in Emporia makes them for serious gardeners. He said the different compartments help keep varieties separate, and the wood is cedar, which naturally repels insects. Margaret lifted the lid to reveal a dozen small compartments lined with soft cloth, each one perfectly sized for storing seeds through the winter months. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and she could smell the pleasant cedar scent that would keep her precious heirloom varieties safe from pests. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "But I couldn't possibly accept something so expensive." "It wasn't expensive," Samuel said quickly. "And even if it was, you gave me something much more valuable, kindness to a stranger, and the best tomatoes I've ever eaten. This is just my way of saying thank you." Judith cleared her throat delicately. "I should probably be getting home," she announced, standing and gathering her coffee cup. "Ezra will wonder what became of me." Margaret wanted to protest suddenly, feeling shy about being alone with Samuel again, but Judith was already making her farewells. "It was lovely meeting you, Mr. McKinnon," Judith said with a meaningful look at Margaret. "I hope we'll see you again soon." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied politely. "I'd like that very much." After Judith had departed, Margaret and Samuel found themselves alone on the porch, the seed box cradled in her lap like a precious gift. The afternoon air was warm and pleasant, filled with the sound of cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle. "This really is too generous," Margaret said, though she couldn't bring herself to hand the box back to him. "I don't understand why you would go to such trouble for someone you barely know." Samuel settled into the chair Judith had vacated, his long legs stretched out comfortably. "Maybe because you don't feel like someone I barely know," he said simply. "Our conversation the other day stayed with me. It's been a long time since I talked to someone who understood about growing things the way you do." Margaret felt that familiar flutter in her chest, the dangerous warmth that made her want to believe in possibilities she had long since abandoned. "You must meet many people in your travels. Surely other gardeners, other women who what?" Samuel interrupted gently. "Who treat me like an ignorant cowboy. Who assume I have nothing to offer beyond physical labor. Who see my age and think they know everything about me." The bitter edge in his voice surprised Margaret. She looked at him more closely, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair. "You sound as if you speak from experience," she observed. Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been working ranches since I was 14, Miss Hartwell. I've met plenty of women who were happy to flirt with the hired help, but wouldn't consider me worthy of serious conversation, let alone genuine affection. Most see a young cowboy and assume I'm either too wild to settle down or too poor to provide for a family." Margaret felt a stab of sympathy for this young man, who carried himself with such confidence, but apparently harbored his own wounds from rejection and dismissal. "I'm sorry. I hadn't considered that youth might bring its own challenges. Just as I imagine you face challenges that come with being an unmarried woman of a certain age," Samuel replied, his green eyes meeting hers directly. "We all have our crosses to bear." The acknowledgement hung between them, honest and unadorned. Margaret realized that perhaps she and Samuel had more in common than their obvious differences might suggest. Both had been dismissed and underestimated. Both had learned to find solace in simple things like gardens and animals. Both understood what it meant to be lonely in a world full of people. "Would you like some supper?" Margaret heard herself asking. "It's nothing fancy, just stew and cornbread, but you're welcome to stay if you'd like." Samuel's face brightened considerably. "I'd be honored, Miss Hartwell. It's been weeks since I've had a home-cooked meal." As Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, she could hear Samuel moving around outside, the sound of his voice as he spoke to his horse. The domesticity of it all, having someone else in her space, preparing a meal for two, felt both foreign and utterly natural. When she called him in for supper, Samuel had washed his hands at the pump and attempted to smooth his hair. He looked younger somehow in the lamplight, but also more serious, as if he understood the significance of being invited into her home. They ate by the light of oil lamps, talking easily about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about the ranch where he'd found temporary work, about the wild horses he helped break, and the cattle drives that took him across 3 states. Margaret found herself sharing stories about her grandmother, about the books she loved to read, about her abandoned attempts at writing novels. What kind of stories do you write? Samuel asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. Oh, they're not very good. Just silly romantic tales about people finding love in unlikely circumstances. That doesn't sound silly to me, Samuel said seriously. Love is the most important thing in the world, isn't it? Why shouldn't it be celebrated in stories? His earnestness touched something deep in Margaret's chest. When had anyone taken her writing seriously, even when she dismissed it herself? I suppose I always thought they were too unrealistic, she admitted. Too much wishful thinking and not enough truth about how difficult relationships actually are. Maybe, Samuel said thoughtfully, but maybe people need a little wishful thinking sometimes. Maybe they need to believe that love is possible, even when their own experience suggests otherwise. Margaret stared at him across the table, struck once again by the unexpected depth of his thoughts. You're not at all what I expected when I first saw you, she said without thinking. What did you expect? Samuel asked with a smile. Margaret realized she had ventured into dangerous territory, but found herself answering honestly. Someone more superficial, I suppose. Someone focused on immediate pleasures rather than deeper concerns. And what do you think now? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Margaret's heart race. She looked into Samuel's green eyes and saw intelligence, kindness, and something else, something that looked remarkably like genuine affection. I think, she said carefully, that I was wrong to make assumptions based on age. Samuel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I'm glad, he said simply, because I'd like very much to know you better, Miss Margaret Hartwell, if you'd be willing to let me try. Margaret stared down at their joined hands as young and strong, hers marked by age and work, and felt something bloom in her chest that she had thought was dead forever. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely impossible, but for the first time in years, she found herself willing to take a leap of faith. I'd like that too, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm Margaret had never experienced, anticipation followed by joy, contentment shadowed by uncertainty. Samuel had taken work at the Morrison ranch just outside of town, close enough to visit every few days, but far enough away to maintain propriety. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded in careful increments, shared meals on her porch, walks through her garden at dusk, long conversations that revealed the depths beneath their different surfaces. Margaret found herself transformed by the experience of being truly seen. Samuel listened when she spoke about her failed novels with the attention of someone who understood that dreams deferred were not dreams destroyed. He asked thoughtful questions about her grandmother's stories, about the isolation that had both protected and imprisoned her, about the fears that had kept her from taking risks in love. In return, she learned about the young man beneath the cowboy exterior. Samuel spoke of his childhood poverty, the shame of being raised by charity after his parents' deaths, the way he had learned to read people's expectations and either fulfill or defy them, depending on what served him best. His education had come from books borrowed from sympathetic ranchers' wives, his wisdom from observation and experience rather than formal schooling. I used to think intelligence meant knowing things from books, Margaret told him one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of coral and gold. But you understand people and situations in ways that no amount of reading could teach. Samuel's hand found hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. And I used to think sophistication meant fancy clothes and formal manners. But you have a grace that comes from something deeper, from being comfortable with who you are, even when the world tries to tell you that's not enough. These moments of mutual admiration created a bubble of contentment around Margaret's small property. But she was not naive enough to believe they existed in isolation. Cottonwood Falls was a small town where everyone's business was common knowledge, and Samuel's frequent visits had not gone unnoticed. The first direct confrontation came on a Saturday morning when Margaret ventured into town for supplies. She had taken extra care with her appearance, wearing her best blue dress and arranging her hair in a style that flattered her still handsome features. The attention from Samuel had awakened a vanity she thought she had outgrown, and she caught herself hoping she might encounter him on the streets of town. Instead, she encountered Reverend Blackwood outside Henley's general store, his austere face wearing an expression of stern disapproval that she recognized from his more fire and brimstone. "Sermons, Miss Hartwell," he said, positioning himself directly in her path. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Margaret's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Reverend. How can I help you?" "It's more a matter of how I might help you," he replied, his voice carrying the authority of moral certainty. "There are rumors circulating about your association with a certain young cowboy. As your spiritual advisor, I feel compelled to address this matter before it goes any further." The phrase spiritual advisor rankled Margaret, given that she attended church sporadically and had never solicited his counsel. But she knew that direct confrontation would only make matters worse. "I'm not sure what rumors you're referring to," she said carefully. "I've offered hospitality to a traveler, nothing more." Reverend Blackwood's pale eyes glittered with skepticism. "Come now, Miss Hartwell. Young McKinnon has been seen at your property repeatedly. He's taken lodging at the Morrison place, specifically to remain in the area. Surely you must understand how this appears to the community." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment, but mostly from anger. "How does it appears to whom, exactly? Who has appointed themselves judge of my private affairs?" "The Lord is the judge of all our affairs," the Reverend replied sanctimoniously. "But as members of a Christian community, we have obligations to guide each other away from sin and folly. And you believe my friendship with Mr. McKinnon constitutes sin or folly?" Reverend Blackwood's expression softened slightly, taking on the patronizing tone he typically reserved for children and wayward women. "Margaret, you're a woman of mature years who has lived independently for some time. Perhaps that isolation has clouded your judgment regarding appropriate behavior. This young man is nearly young enough to be your son. Whatever his intentions, and I reserve judgment on those, surely you can see that such an association reflects poorly on your character." The words struck Margaret like physical blows, not because they were unexpected, but because they voiced the doubts that plagued her own quiet moments. The Reverend was saying nothing she hadn't thought of herself during the long nights when sleep eluded her and fear whispered that she was making a fool of herself. "Mr. McKinnon is a gentleman," she said quietly. "He has treated me with nothing but respect." "I'm sure he has," Reverend Blackwood replied, his tone suggesting he meant nothing of the sort. "But respect is not the issue here. The issue is propriety, and the example you set for the younger women of our community. What message does it send when a woman of your age pursues a liaison with someone so obviously inappropriate?" Margaret's temper finally snapped. "I am not pursuing anything, Reverend. I am simply enjoying the conversation of an intelligent, thoughtful man who happens to be younger than I am. If that offends your sensibilities, I suggest you examine whether your concerns stem from Christian charity or mere prejudice." The Reverend's face flushed red above his clerical collar. "Miss Hartwell, I strongly advise you to consider the consequences of your actions. This community has been patient with your eccentricities for many years. But there are limits to that patience, particularly when those eccentricities begin to affect others." "Affect others how?" Margaret demanded. "Who exactly is being harmed by my private friendships?" "Young McKinnon, for one," the Reverend replied sharply. "You may think you're offering him companionship, but you're potentially damaging his reputation and his prospects. What respectable young woman would consider marrying a man who had been involved with a woman old enough to be his mother?" The cruelty of the words took Margaret's breath away. She had not considered that her association with Samuel might harm his future prospects, might mark him as someone with questionable judgment or unusual appetites. The possibility that she might be damaging the very man she was growing to care for deeply was almost unbearable. "I see you understand my point," Reverend Blackwood said, noting her stricken expression. "I trust you'll make the right decision regarding this unfortunate situation." Margaret walked home in a daze, the Reverend's words echoing in her mind like a curse. She had been so focused on her own fears about the propriety of her feelings that she had failed to consider how the relationship might affect Samuel. The thought that she might be harming his reputation, limiting his opportunities for happiness with someone more suitable, filled her with a guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. When Samuel arrived that evening for their usual dinner, Margaret was waiting on the porch with a resolve that felt as fragile as spun glass. He dismounted with his characteristic easy grace, his face brightening at the sight of her, and Margaret felt her heart break a little at the genuine pleasure in his expression. "You look troubled," he said immediately, his perceptive eyes reading the tension in her posture. "What's wrong?" Margaret had rehearsed this conversation during the long afternoon, but facing Samuel's concerned gaze made the words stick in her throat. How could she explain without sounding as if she was rejecting him personally rather than trying to protect him? "I had an unpleasant encounter in town today," she began carefully. "Reverend Blackwood approached me with concerns about our friendship." Samuel's expression darkened immediately. "What kind of concerns?" "He believes our association is inappropriate given the difference in our ages. He suggested that it reflects poorly on both our characters and might damage your future prospects." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but edged with anger. "And what did you tell him?" "I defended our friendship," Margaret said. "But Samuel, what if he's right? What if I'm being selfish, thinking only of my own happiness without considering the consequences for you?" Samuel stepped closer, his green eyes intense in the gathering dusk. "Margaret, look at me. Do you believe I'm a child who can't make his own decisions about his life and his associations?" "Of course not," Margaret replied quickly. "But you're young, with your whole life ahead of you. You should be free to court someone appropriate, someone who could give you the family and future you deserve." "And who decides what I deserve?" Samuel asked. "You, Reverend Blackwood? The gossips in town who have nothing better to do than speculate about other people's private business." Margaret felt tears threaten and looked away. "I just don't want to be the reason you miss out on real happiness." Samuel reached out and gently turned her face back toward him. "Margaret, you are real happiness. These past weeks have been the most content I've felt since my grandmother died. For the first time in years, I look forward to each day because I know I'll get to see you, talk to you, learn something new about the remarkable woman you are. But what about children?" Margaret whispered. "What about the traditional life most men want?" Samuel's smile was sad but determined. "I've been on my own since I was 8 years old. I've seen what traditional families can be. I've also seen what they can't be. Some of the loneliest people I've known were surrounded by spouses and children who didn't understand them. Some of the happiest were like my grandmother and me, two people who chose each other and built something meaningful together." Margaret wanted to believe him, but the Reverend's words had planted seeds of doubt that were already taking root. "Samuel, I care about you too much to let you sacrifice your future for something that might not last. And I care about you too much to let fear and other people's prejudices destroy something that could be wonderful," Samuel countered. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm not asking you to make promises you're not ready to make. I'm just asking you not to end this because someone else thinks it's inappropriate." Margaret sank into her porch chair, feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of decision. What if they're right, though? What if we're both too caught up in the novelty of this to see it clearly? Samuel knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Then we'll discover that together, in our own time. But Margaret, please don't let them decide for us. Give us a chance to figure out what this is, and what it might become. Margaret looked into his earnest face and felt her resolve wavering. The Reverend's argument seemed less compelling when faced with Samuel's obvious sincerity, but the doubts remained, whispering that she was being foolish and selfish. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is all happening so fast, and I'm not sure I trust my own judgment anymore." Samuel nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. But Margaret, while you're thinking, remember this, I'm here by choice. I'm not some lost boy who stumbled into your life by accident. I'm a man who has traveled hundreds of miles, worked dozens of jobs, and met countless people. And of all the places I could be, all the people I could spend my time with, I choose to be here with you." He rose and stepped back, giving her space but not withdrawing entirely. "I'll respect whatever decision you make, but I hope you'll base it on what we actually have together, not on what other people think we should have." After Samuel left, Margaret sat alone on her porch until well past midnight, watching the stars wheel overhead and trying to untangle the competing voices in her head. The Reverend's warnings mingled with Samuel's assurances. Her own fears battled with her growing affection, and through it all ran the persistent question of whether she had the right to claim happiness at the potential cost of someone else's future. The next morning brought another visitor in the form of Clara Morrison, wife of Samuel's current employer. Clara was a woman Margaret respected, practical, fair-minded, and known for her ability to see past surface appearances to underlying truths. "I hope you don't mind me calling unannounced," Clara said as Margaret invited her in for coffee. "But I wanted to speak with you about Samuel McKinnon." Margaret's heart sank, expecting another lecture about propriety and appropriate behavior. Instead, Clara surprised her. "He's a good man," Clara said without preamble. "My husband has employed dozens of cowboys over the years, and most of them are either wild boys looking for trouble or hard men looking for drink and easy women. Samuel is neither. He works harder than anyone we've ever hired, treats our animals with genuine care, and carries himself with more dignity than half the so-called gentlemen in town." Margaret blinked in surprise. "That's very kind of you to say." "I'm not being kind," Clara replied briskly. "I'm being honest. And I'm also being honest when I say that I've never seen him as content as he's been these past weeks. Whatever is happening between you two has been good for him. But surely you must see how inappropriate. I see a young man who has been taking care of himself since childhood, finally finding someone who appreciates his mind as well as his work ethic." Clara interrupted. "I see a woman who has been alone too long, finally finding someone who values her for herself, rather than trying to change her into something more conventional." Clara leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Margaret, I've been married for 23 years to a man 7 years older than me. When we met, everyone said he was too old, that I should find someone my own age. We ignored them, and it was the best decision I ever made. Age matters far less than compatibility, respect, and genuine affection. But the difference between 7 years and 25 years is significant. I grant you," Clara acknowledged, "but not insurmountable if both parties understand what they're choosing. Samuel isn't a naive boy, Margaret. He's a man who has seen enough of the world to know his own mind. If he chooses you, it's because he sees something worth choosing." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm so afraid of ruining his life." "And what about your life?" Clara asked gently. "Don't you deserve happiness too? Don't you deserve to be loved for exactly who you are, by someone who sees past your age to the woman beneath?" The questions hung in the air between them, challenging Margaret to consider possibilities she had been too frightened to examine. For so long, she had defined herself by what she lacked that she had forgotten to consider what she might have to offer. "I don't know how to navigate this," Margaret admitted. "I've never been in a situation like this before." "None of us have scripts for love," Clara replied with a smile. "We all make it up as we go along, hoping for the best and trying to be kind to each other along the way. The question is whether you're willing to try, despite the risks." After Clara left, Margaret found herself back in her garden, seeking solace among the plants that had been her companions for so many years. The Cherokee purple tomatoes were ripening in abundance, their deep red shoulders catching the afternoon sun like jewels. She thought about the seed box Samuel had given her, about the care he had taken to find something that honored her passion for growing things. As she worked among the plants, Margaret realized that gardening itself was an act of faith, planting seeds without knowing what the weather would bring, tending growth without guaranteeing harvest, believing that careful attention and patience would yield something beautiful and nourishing. Perhaps love was not so different. Perhaps it required the same willingness to plant hope in uncertain ground, to tend carefully to something fragile and valuable, to believe that good intentions and mutual care could create something worth the risk of disappointment. The sun was setting when Samuel's familiar silhouette appeared on the road, and Margaret felt her heart lift despite her afternoon of agonizing. Whatever decision she made, she realized it should be based on what felt true between them rather than on fear of what others might think. As he approached the gate, Margaret made a choice that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would trust in the connection they had built, in the respect and affection that had grown between them, in the possibility that love might indeed come in unexpected packages to those brave enough to receive it. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Margaret found herself willing to step into that uncertainty with hope rather than fear as her companion. October arrived with a crisp bite in the air and the promise of winter lurking just beyond the amber-dressed hills. Margaret had made her choice to continue seeing Samuel despite the town's disapproval, but that decision brought new challenges neither of them had anticipated. The whispers followed her through Cottonwood Falls, like shadows, conversations that stopped when she entered shops, meaningful glances exchanged between neighbors, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how people treated her. Samuel felt the ostracism, too, though it manifested differently for him. The other ranch hands at Morrison's place began treating him with a mixture of bewilderment and crude amusement, making jokes about older women and easy money that left him furious and defensive. More troubling were the warnings from potential employers who had heard rumors about his peculiar situation and decided he might not be the kind of man they wanted working their land. "It's getting harder to find work," Samuel admitted to Margaret. One evening as they sat by her fireplace, the first fire of the season crackling cheerfully between them. "Word travels fast in ranching communities, and apparently my reputation has become complicated." Margaret felt the familiar stab of guilt that had been her constant companion for weeks. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're being penalized for association with me." Samuel reached for her hand across the small space between their chairs. "We're both being penalized for refusing to live according to other people's narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. That's not the same thing." Despite his reassuring words, Margaret could see the strain and the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he spoke about the hostility he encountered. She knew he was protecting her from the worst of it, just as she tried to shield him from the cruel comments that reached her ears in town. The situation escalated dramatically on a Thursday afternoon when Margaret encountered Mrs. Abernathy and her daughter Constance outside the post office. Constance was 22, blonde, and possessed of the kind of fragile beauty that made men want to protect her. She had been making eyes at Samuel since his arrival in town, a fact that had not escaped Margaret's notice. "Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Abernathy said with false sweetness. "How nice to see you. Constance and I were just discussing Mr. McKinnon. Such a shame about his difficulties finding steady employment." Margaret's spine stiffened. "I wasn't aware he was having difficulties." Constance stepped forward with a practiced smile that didn't reach her pale blue eyes. Oh yes, Papa was considering hiring him for our fall roundup, but when he heard about Mr. McKinnon's questionable associations, he decided it might not be wise. We can't have our reputation sullied by employing someone whose judgment is so suspect. The deliberate cruelty of this statement took Margaret's breath away. Here was a girl young enough to be her daughter, speaking with the casual viciousness that only comes from absolute certainty of one's social position. I see, Margaret managed, her voice carefully controlled. And what exactly do you find questionable about Mr. McKinnon's judgment? Mrs. Abernathy tittered nervously. Now, Margaret, surely you must understand how your friendship appears to people. A young man of Mr. McKinnon's age pursuing a woman of your years well. It suggests either mercenary motives or a disturbing lack of normal masculine instincts. Unless, of course, Constance added with malicious innocence, he simply feels sorry for you. Charity can sometimes be mistaken for genuine affection, particularly by those desperate to believe in it. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. The suggestion that Samuel's attention was motivated by pity rather than genuine affection struck at her deepest insecurities, while the implication that she was too desperate to recognize the difference added insult to injury. How kind of you to be so concerned about my well-being, Margaret replied, her voice dangerously quiet. Perhaps you should focus on your own romantic prospects rather than analyzing mine. Constance's cheeks flushed pink, but her mother stepped protectively forward. There's no need for hostility, Margaret. We're simply trying to help you see the situation clearly before you embarrass yourself further. And before you ruin a perfectly good young man's future, Constance added. Someone like Mr. McKinnon could find happiness with an appropriate woman, someone who could give him children and grow old beside him rather than leaving him a widower in his prime. Margaret walked home in a state of numb shock, the young woman's words echoing in her mind with devastating clarity. Was she truly so blind to her own situation? Was Samuel's kindness merely pity dressed up as affection? The possibility that she had been deluding herself about the nature of their connection made her feel sick with shame and self-doubt. When Samuel arrived that evening, he found Margaret sitting on her front steps despite the October chill, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like defeat. Margaret? He approached cautiously, reading the distress in her posture. What's happened? She looked up at him, this young man whose green eyes held such warmth and concern, and felt the weight of all her doubts crashing down at once. Samuel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He settled beside her on the steps, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not touching. Of course, what is it? Margaret took a shaky breath. Do you feel sorry for me? Is that what this is, some misguided attempt to rescue a lonely old woman from her pathetic existence? Samuel's reaction was immediate and visceral. His head snapped back as if she had slapped him, and his face went through a series of expressions: hurt, anger, and something that looked like betrayal. Is that really what you think of me? He asked, his voice tight with emotion. That I'm either a liar or a fool who can't tell the difference between pity and genuine affection? I don't know what to think anymore, Margaret admitted, tears threatening to spill over. Everyone keeps telling me how impossible this is, how inappropriate, how I'm either deluding myself or damaging your future. Maybe they're right. Maybe I've been so lonely for so long that I've misinterpreted kindness for something more meaningful. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Tell me exactly what happened today. Margaret recounted her encounter with the Abernathys, watching Samuel's expression grow darker with each detail. When she finished, he stood abruptly and paced to the edge of the porch, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. So Constance Abernathy, who has been throwing herself at every unmarried man in 3 counties, has decided to play expert on my motivations, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. And her mother, who married for money and has been miserable ever since, wants to lecture us about appropriate relationships. But what if they're right about some of it? Margaret pressed. What if I am holding you back from finding someone more suitable? Samuel turned to face her, his green eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. Margaret, look at me. Really look at me. Do I seem like a man who would waste months of his life on charity? Do I strike you as someone who lacks the backbone to pursue what he actually wants? No, Margaret whispered, because he didn't. Despite his youth, Samuel carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own mind. Then why would you believe I'm here for any reason other than the one I've told you repeatedly? That I care about you, that I enjoy your company, that I find you more interesting and attractive than any woman I've ever met. The word attractive sent heat flooding through Margaret's cheeks. She had stopped thinking of herself in those terms years ago, but the way Samuel looked at her sometimes made her feel like a woman rather than just a spinster approaching old age. But I'm 53, she said weakly. You could have anyone. I don't want anyone, Samuel replied firmly. I want you. Exactly as you are, exactly the age you are, with all your intelligence and kindness and stubborn independence. Why is that so hard for you to believe? Margaret felt tears spill over, a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Because it seems too good to be true. Because I've spent so many years believing I wasn't worth wanting. I don't know how to accept that someone might actually want me. Samuel crossed back to her and knelt in front of the steps, taking her hands in his. Margaret, I understand why other people's opinions matter to you. I understand why you're afraid of making a mistake. But please don't let their prejudices convince you to throw away something real and beautiful, because it doesn't fit their narrow ideas about how love should look. What if we're wrong about this? Margaret asked. What if the age difference proves to be too much? What if you wake up in 5 years and realize you've wasted your youth on someone who was never right for you? Samuel's grip on her hands tightened. What if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow? What if the sky falls? What if any of 1,000 terrible things happen? Margaret, we can't live our lives based on what might go wrong. We have to make choices based on what feels right now, in this moment, with the information we have. And this feels right to you? This feels like the rightest thing that's ever happened to me, Samuel said without hesitation. Does it feel right to you? Margaret looked into his earnest face and felt something settle in her chest, a quiet certainty that cut through all the doubt and fear. Yes, she whispered. It does. Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his features and reminding Margaret why she had been drawn to him in the first place. Then that's what matters. Not what the Abernathys think, not what Reverend Blackwood preaches, not what anyone else believes we should or shouldn't do. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the evening sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Margaret felt as if she had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally exhale. There's something else, Samuel said eventually, his tone becoming more serious. I've been offered a job managing a small ranch outside Abilene. The pay is good, and it would be permanent work instead of these temporary positions I've been taking. Margaret's heart sank. Abilene was 200 miles away, far enough that regular visits would be impossible. When would you leave? That depends, Samuel said carefully. The offer is contingent on bringing my own crew, which means I'd need to find reliable hands willing to make the move. But more importantly, it depends on whether I have a reason to stay in Kansas. The implication hung between them like a bridge Margaret could either cross or burn. She understood what he was asking without him having to say it directly. Samuel, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the thoughts tumbling through her mind. I'm not asking for promises, he said quickly. I'm not asking you to uproot your life or abandon everything you've built here. I'm just asking if you think what we have might be worth exploring more seriously. Margaret thought about her cottage, about the garden she had tended for 20 years, about the life she had built in careful isolation. Then she thought about the past months, about the joy she had found in Samuel's company, about the way he made her feel valued and desired and fully alive. "What would that look like?" she asked. Samuel's face brightened with hope. "I don't know exactly. Maybe I take the job and we see if what we have can survive separation. Maybe we will find a way for you to visit, to see if you could be happy somewhere new. Maybe we're brave enough to consider building something together, despite what anyone else thinks." The possibilities stretched out before Margaret like uncharted territory, both terrifying and exhilarating. For so long, her life had been predictable, safe, limited to the boundaries of her property and her fears. The idea of expanding those boundaries, of choosing adventure over security, made her heart race with equal parts excitement and terror. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is a big decision, bigger than anything I've ever contemplated." Samuel nodded, though she could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. "How much time?" "A week," Margaret said. "Give me a week to sort through everything, to figure out what I really want versus what I think I should want. And in the meantime—" Margaret reached out and touched his face, marveling at the smoothness of his skin, the warmth of his cheek against her palm. "In the meantime, we continue as we have been. No matter what I decide about the future, I don't want to waste the present worrying about it." Samuel leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. "I can live with that." As if to test their resolve, the sound of hoofbeats on the road interrupted their moment. Margaret and Samuel turned to see Constance Abernathy approaching on a sleek chestnut mare, her riding habit immaculate despite the evening hour. "Mr. McKinnon," Constance called as she drew near the gate. "How fortunate to find you here. I was hoping we might have a word." Samuel's expression hardened, but he stood politely. "Miss Abernathy, what can I do for you?" Constance dismounted with practiced grace and approached the porch, her blue eyes fixed on Samuel with calculated determination. "I wanted to apologize for my mother's rather pointed comments this afternoon. She can be quite direct in her opinions." "And what about your own comments?" Margaret asked coolly. Constance's smile became strained. "I'm afraid I may have spoken hastily. Sometimes concern for a friend's well-being can make one overly protective." The false apology was clearly directed at Samuel rather than Margaret, a transparent attempt to position herself as the reasonable alternative to their scandalous relationship. Margaret watched Samuel's reaction carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened with barely controlled irritation. "Your concern is noted but unnecessary," Samuel replied curtly. "Miss Hartwell and I are quite capable of managing our own affairs." "Of course," Constance agreed smoothly. "But I did want you to know that Papa has reconsidered his position regarding employment. If you're still interested in work, we could certainly find a place for a man of your obvious talents." The emphasis on the last word was unmistakable, as was the implication that Samuel's talents might be appreciated in contexts beyond ranch work. Margaret felt anger rise in her throat at the girl's brazen attempt to seduce Samuel practically in front of her. "I appreciate the offer," Samuel said with icy politeness, "but I'm afraid I'm not available for employment with your family." Constance's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of genuine irritation. "That's a shame. There are so few opportunities for advancement in this area, especially for men whose associations might limit their prospects elsewhere." "Miss Abernathy," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet, "I believe you've said enough. Good evening." The dismissal was unmistakable, and even Constance's considerable confidence couldn't withstand its finality. She remounted her horse with less grace than she had dismounted, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and wounded pride. "Good evening," she replied stiffly, then rode away without another word. "Well," Margaret said when the hoofbeats had faded, "that was illuminating." Samuel sat back down beside her, shaking his head in disgust. 22 years old and already a master manipulator. Her poor future husband. You handled that well, Margaret observed. She's not accustomed to being refused. She'll learn, Samuel replied grimly. Though I suspect she make our lives more difficult before she accepts it. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Constance Abernathy was young, beautiful, and vindictive. A dangerous combination for anyone who had crossed her. The encounter served as a stark reminder that their relationship existed in hostile territory, surrounded by people who would be happy to see it fail. Samuel, Margaret said quietly, are you sure this is worth all the trouble it's causing? He turned to look at her, his green eyes serious in the gathering twilight. Margaret, some things in life are worth fighting for. This is one of them. The question is whether you think so too. As the stars began to appear overhead, Margaret realized that was exactly the question she needed to answer in the week ahead. Not whether their relationship was perfect or easy or socially acceptable, but whether it was worth fighting for despite all the obstacles arrayed against them. The answer, she was beginning to suspect, would determine not just their future together, but the kind of woman she wanted to be for whatever years remained to her. The week Margaret had requested to make her decision stretched before her like an eternity of sleepless nights and restless days. She found herself wandering through her cottage at all hours, touching familiar objects as if trying to memorize their weight and texture. The blue willow china that had been her grandmother's, the quilts folded in the cedar chest, the kitchen table where she had eaten solitary meals for 20 years, all of it suddenly felt precious and fragile, like things that might be lost. If she made the wrong choice. Samuel respected her need for space, though she could see the strain in his face when he stopped by to check on her. Their conversations had become careful, polite things, dancing around the enormous question that hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. He was leaving for Abilene in 10 days with or without an answer, a deadline that ticked away in Margaret's consciousness like a heartbeat counting down to some unknown fate. On Wednesday morning, Margaret was startled from her restless sleep by urgent pounding on her front door. She threw on her wrapper and hurried downstairs to find Dr. Benjamin Hayes on her porch, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Margaret, thank God you're here," he said without preamble. "I need your help. Grace Henderson has gone into labor 3 weeks early, and there are complications. The baby is breech, and I can't manage alone." Margaret didn't hesitate. She had assisted Dr. Hayes with difficult births before, and her steady hands and calm presence had helped bring more than a dozen babies safely into the world. "Let me get dressed. I'll meet you at the Henderson place in 15 minutes. The ride to the Henderson farm passed in tense silence, both Margaret and Dr. Hayes lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. Grace Henderson was 38, and attempting her 5th pregnancy after losing 2 babies in infancy. The stakes couldn't be higher for a family that had already endured more than its share of heartbreak. The scene at the Henderson farmhouse was controlled chaos. Grace's husband Thomas paced the kitchen like a caged animal while their 3 surviving children huddled together in the front room, their eyes wide with fear they didn't fully understand. Grace's mother-in-law, a capable woman named Ruth, met them at the door with relief written plainly on her weathered face. "She's been laboring since midnight," Ruth reported quickly. "The pains are strong, but the baby won't come. Grace is getting weak and we're all afraid. She didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened to women who labored too long without progress. Margaret squeezed Ruth's shoulder reassuringly before following Dr. Hayes into the bedroom where Grace lay pale and exhausted, her nightgown soaked with sweat. "Grace, dear," Margaret said softly, taking the younger woman's hand. "Dr. Hayes and I are here now. We're going to help you and your baby." Grace's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Margaret, I'm so scared. Something's wrong, I can feel it. Shoo, Margaret soothed, smoothing Grace's damp hair back from her forehead. You're going to be fine. Dr. Hayes is the best physician in 3 counties, and I've helped deliver more babies than I can count. We won't let anything happen to you or your little one. Dr. Hayes completed his examination with gentle efficiency, his face grave when he looked up at Margaret. The baby is definitely breech, and the cord is around its neck. We need to turn it, but it's going to be difficult. Margaret nodded, understanding the risks involved. A breech birth was dangerous enough under the best circumstances, but adding a cord complication made the situation potentially fatal for both mother and child. They would need to work quickly and precisely, with no room for error. What do you need me to do? Margaret asked. Hold Grace steady and keep her calm while I attempt the external version. If I can turn the baby from the outside, we might avoid surgery. For the next hour, Margaret held Grace Henderson's hands and whispered encouragement while Dr. Hayes worked to manipulate the baby into a safer position. The process was agonizing for Grace, who tried desperately not to scream and wake the children. Sleeping in the next room, Margaret found herself drawing on reserves of strength and compassion she hadn't known she possessed, becoming an anchor of calm in the storm of the medical crisis. There, Dr. Hayes said finally, his voice thick with relief. I can feel the head presenting normally now. Grace, on your next contraction, I want you to push as hard as you can. 20 minutes later, baby Mary Henderson entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Margaret caught the slippery, squirming infant and placed her immediately on Grace's chest, marveling as always at the miracle of new life emerging from what had seemed like certain tragedy. She's perfect, Grace sobbed, touching her daughter's tiny fingers with wonder. She's absolutely perfect. Dr. Hayes completed the delivery and examined both mother and baby thoroughly before declaring them both healthy and stable. As he packed his instruments, he turned to Margaret with genuine gratitude. I couldn't have managed without you, he said quietly. Your calm presence made all the difference. Grace trusts you completely, and that trust helped her stay relaxed. Enough for me to turn the baby. Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction unlike anything she had experienced in years. For 5 hours she had been completely absorbed in helping another human being through the most vulnerable moment of her life. Her age, her unmarried status, her uncertain romantic future, none of it had mattered. What mattered was her skill, her compassion, and her willingness to be present when someone needed her most. As they prepared to leave, Grace caught Margaret's hand. I want you to be Mary's godmother, she said with quiet intensity. Promise me you'll watch over her as she grows up. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. I would be honored. The ride back to her cottage gave Margaret time to process what had just happened. She had always known that she was good at helping with births, that she had a natural talent for remaining calm under pressure and providing comfort to frightened women. But she had never considered how much that skill might mean to the broader community, how her presence at crucial moments might be genuinely valued and needed. When Samuel arrived for dinner that evening, he found Margaret sitting on her porch, with an expression of quiet contemplation he hadn't seen before. You look different, he observed, settling into the chair beside her. Peaceful somehow. Margaret told him about the day's events, about Grace Henderson and baby Mary, about the way it felt to be essential to something larger than her own worries and fears. As she spoke, she saw understanding dawn in Samuel's green eyes. You were meant for this, he said when she finished. Helping people, being there when they need you most. It's who you are. I think it might be, Margaret agreed. I think I've been so focused on what I lack that I've forgotten what I have to offer. Samuel leaned forward, his expression intense. Margaret, what if I told you that Abilene has been looking for someone exactly like you? The territory is growing so fast that doctors are few and far between. Women with midwifery skills are desperately needed, especially someone with your experience and calm temperament. Margaret's heart began to race. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe this isn't about you giving up your life to follow. And me. Maybe this is about both of us finding new lives that make better use of our gifts. You could establish yourself as a midwife in Abilene, become an essential part of a growing community. And I could build something permanent instead of drifting from ranch to ranch. The possibility was dizzying. Margaret had never considered that her skills might be portable, that she could create a meaningful life somewhere new. The idea of being genuinely needed, of building a reputation based on her abilities rather than her eccentricities, was intoxicating. But what about us? She asked. What about the age difference, the gossip, all the problems that would follow us to Texas? Samuel's smile was gentle but determined. What about them? Margaret, every place has gossips and busybodies. But growing communities are usually more focused on survival than scandal. People who need your help aren't going to care about your age or who you're keeping company with. Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time in her adult life, she was considering making a choice based on possibility rather than fear, on what she might gain rather than what she might lose. Samuel, she said slowly, are you asking me to come with you to Abilene? I'm asking you to consider building a life with me, he replied carefully. Not as my dependent or my charity case, but as my partner. Someone who brings as much to the relationship as she takes from it. The word partner resonated through Margaret like a bell struck in a quiet cathedral. She had never thought of herself in those terms, as someone who could be an equal contributor to a romantic partnership rather than a burden or a consolation prize. I need to know something, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you asking because you love me, or because you think we could have a practical arrangement that benefits us both? Samuel's face grew serious, and he moved his chair closer to hers. Margaret, I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now, but maybe simple is better. I love you. Not because you're convenient or because I feel sorry for you, but because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. You're intelligent and kind and stronger than you give yourself credit for. When I imagine my future, I can't picture it without you in it. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks, tears of relief and joy, and something that felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. I love you too, she whispered. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do. I love you. So much it terrifies me. Samuel reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. Then say yes. Say you'll come with me, that you'll trust us enough to take this leap together. Margaret looked into his earnest face, seeing not just the handsome young cowboy who had first caught her attention, but the thoughtful, determined man who had spent months proving his devotion. She thought about Grace Henderson, about baby Mary, about the way it felt to be essential to someone else's happiness. She thought about the cottage that had been both sanctuary and prison, about the life she had built in careful isolation. Yes, she said, the word coming out like a prayer. Yes, I'll come with you. Samuel's face lit up with joy so pure and intense that Margaret felt her heart swell to the point of bursting. He leaned forward and kissed her then, their first real kiss, soft and tentative at first, but growing more confident as Margaret responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and smiling like fools. We'll need to be married before we leave, Samuel said practically. I won't have people thinking poorly of you because of irregular arrangements. Margaret laughed, a sound so light and happy that it surprised them both. Samuel McKinnon, are you proposing to me? I guess I am, he replied with a grin. Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, will you marry me and come to Texas and build something wonderful together? Yes, Margaret said again, because the word felt so good she wanted to keep saying it. Yes, absolutely yes. They spent the evening making plans with the excited energy of children plotting an adventure. Samuel would send word to Abilene accepting the ranch management position. Margaret would begin the process of selling her property and belongings, keeping only what was most precious and portable. They would marry in a simple ceremony before leaving Kansas, perhaps with just Dr. Hayes and the Morrisons as witnesses. "What about the people who disapprove?" Margaret asked as they sat close together on the porch, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. "Constance Abernathy will be beside herself." "Let her be," Samuel replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Margaret's head. "We're not living our lives for Constance Abernathy or anyone else who thinks they know better than we do what will make us happy." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Judith Carmichael, who arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a knowing smile that suggested she had heard about the previous evening's developments. "I take it, congratulations are in order," Judith said without preamble as Margaret invited her in for coffee. "How did you?" "Samuel stopped by our place this morning to ask Ezra about selling livestock quickly," Judith explained with obvious amusement. He was practically glowing with happiness. Ezra said he'd never seen a man so eager to get married and move to Texas. Margaret felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and pleasure. "We haven't told anyone else yet." "Your secret is safe with me," Judith assured her. "But Margaret, I want you to know how happy I am for you. You deserve love, and you deserve adventure. Samuel is a good man who sees your worth clearly. Are you sure I'm not making a terrible mistake?" Margaret asked, the old doubts creeping back in. "Leaving everything I know to follow a man to a strange place?" Judith's expression grew serious. "Margaret, I've watched you for 15 years slowly disappearing into this cottage, becoming smaller and quieter with each passing season. In the past few months, I've watched you come back to life. That's not a mistake, that's a miracle." The validation from her oldest friend in Cottonwood Falls meant more to Margaret than she could express. Judith had known her through all the years of lonely spinsterhood, had witnessed her gradual retreat from hope and possibility. If Judith believed she was making the right choice, perhaps she truly was. "There will be gossip," Margaret warned. "Let them gossip," Judith replied firmly. "In 5 years, they'll have found new scandals to occupy their time, but you'll still be living your adventure." Over the next week, Margaret threw herself into the practical aspects of leaving her old life behind. She met with a land agent about selling the property, carefully sorted through her possessions to determine what was worth keeping, and began the complex process of transferring 20 years of accumulated life into a manageable collection of essentials. The hardest part was deciding what to do with her grandmother's china, the quilts that had been in her family for generations, the books that had been her constant companions through so many lonely evenings. In the end, she kept one place setting of china, her grandmother's wedding ring quilt, and a carefully chosen selection of her most beloved novels. Everything else would be sold or given away to neighbors who might appreciate them. Samuel helped with the practical arrangements, demonstrating a capacity for organization and attention to detail that impressed Margaret. He negotiated with buyers for her livestock, arranged for the transport of her chosen possessions, and handled the myriad details involved in relocating 2 lives across several hundred miles. "You're very good at this," Margaret observed one evening as they reviewed lists of tasks still to be completed. "My grandmother always said that proper planning prevents poor performance," Samuel replied with a smile. "I learned early that hoping for the best works better when you prepare for the worst." Their wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday, a simple ceremony in Margaret's front parlor with Dr. Hayes officiating and the Morrisons serving as witnesses. Margaret had chosen to wear her best blue dress, the same one she had worn to town the day of her confrontation with the Abernathys, rather than purchasing something new for the occasion. "I want to remember this as the dress I was wearing when I chose happiness over fear," she explained to Judith, who had come to help her prepare. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. conducted in the room where Margaret had spent so many solitary evenings reading by lamplight. Samuel wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased specifically for the occasion, his sandy hair neatly combed and his face shining with joy. When Dr. Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Margaret with gentle reverence, as if she were made of precious porcelain that might break if handled too roughly. Margaret kissed him back with growing confidence, marveling at how natural it felt to be claimed and protected by this man who had seen past her age to the woman beneath. "Mrs. McKinnon," Samuel murmured against her ear as their small group of witnesses applauded. "Mrs. McKinnon," Margaret repeated, testing the unfamiliar name on her tongue. It sounded like a new beginning, like a door opening onto possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The celebration was modest cake and coffee. In Margaret's kitchen, toasts with elderberry wine that Clara Morrison had brought for the occasion. But the warmth and genuine affection of their small group of supporters made the evening feel magical despite its simplicity. As their guests prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes pulled Margaret aside for a private word. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that your decision to leave gives me hope for my own future. I've been considering a move to California myself, where the opportunities for medical practice are greater. Seeing you choose adventure over security reminds me that age doesn't have to mean acceptance of limitations." Margaret felt a rush of pride at the thought that her choice might inspire others to pursue their own dreams. "Follow your heart, Benjamin. Life is too short to spend it safe and sorry." After everyone had gone, Margaret and Samuel sat together in the lamplight of their kitchen, planning their departure for the following Tuesday. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and melancholy as she looked around the room that had sheltered her for so long. "Are you sorry to leave?" Samuel asked, reading her expression accurately. "Not sorry exactly," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "Grateful, maybe. This place protected me when I needed protection. But I don't need protection anymore. I need adventure." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "We're going to have wonderful adventures together, Mrs. McKinnon," he said with quiet confidence. "I promise you that." Margaret looked into her husband's green eyes and felt the last of her doubts dissolve like morning mist in sunlight. Whatever challenges awaited them in Texas, whatever obstacles they might face as a couple whose love defied conventional expectations, they would meet them together. For the first time in her 53 years, Margaret Eleanor Hartwell McKinnon was exactly where she belonged, not in spite of her age, but because of all the wisdom and strength those years had given her. The future stretched ahead like an open road, full of possibilities she had never dared to dream. The wagon train to Abilene departed Cottonwood Falls on a crisp Tuesday morning in early November, carrying the possessions of 3 families seeking opportunity in the expanding Texas territories. Margaret sat beside Samuel on the driver's bench of their loaded wagon, watching the familiar landmarks of her old life disappear behind rolling hills and autumn-brown prairie grass. The cedar seed box Samuel had given her rode carefully cushioned between quilts and books, along with the precious Cherokee purple tomato, seeds that would link her new garden to generations of family tradition. The journey south promised to take 12 days if weather and circumstances cooperated. Margaret had never traveled more than 50 miles from Cottonwood Falls in her entire life, but she found herself energized rather than anxious about the prospect of crossing 3 states to reach their destination. Samuel's steady presence beside her, the purposeful nature of their mission, and the knowledge that she was moving towards something meaningful rather than simply away from disappointment, gave her a sense of adventure she had never experienced. Their fellow travelers were the Brennan family, Patrick and Colleen with their 4 children ranging from 6 to 16, and the elderly Miller couple who were relocating to live near their married daughter in Austin. Both families had been curious but respectful about the obvious age difference between Margaret and Samuel. accepting their cover story about being a widow and widower who had found companionship in their shared loss. "Best to keep our business private until we're established," Samuel had advised, and Margaret agreed. The truth about their unconventional courtship was nobody's affair but their own, and she preferred to be judged on her merits rather than her romantic choices. By the third day of travel, Margaret had established herself as the expedition's unofficial medical authority. When young Timothy Brennan developed a fever and stomach complaints, she prepared willow bark tea and administered careful doses of ginger root that soon had him feeling well enough to resume his usual mischief. When Mrs. Miller began suffering from the joint pain that plagued her in cold weather, Margaret's knowledge of herbal remedies provided relief that even surprised the older woman. "Where did you learn so much about healing?" Colleen Brennan asked. One evening as they sat around the communal campfire, her tone filled with genuine admiration. "My grandmother was what people called a granny woman back in Missouri," Margaret replied, stirring the pot of stew she had prepared for the group. "She taught me that most ailments could be treated with plants if you knew which ones to use, and how to prepare them properly." Samuel watched her with obvious pride as she shared her knowledge, and Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction at being valued for her skills rather than pitied for her circumstances. These people saw her as a capable woman with useful knowledge, not as an old maid who had failed to find a husband in her prime. The evenings around the campfire became Margaret's favorite part of each day. After the wagons were circled and the animals tended, the adults would gather to share stories, plan the next day's route, and discuss their hopes for their new lives. Margaret found herself contributing more to these conversations than she had to any social gathering in years, her natural intelligence and thoughtful observations earning respect from people who had initially seen her as simply Samuel's quiet wife. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding midwifery in Abilene," Patrick Brennan said one night, addressing Margaret across the flickering flames. "My Colleen here has delivered 5 babies, but she's always said she'd feel more confident with someone experienced to guide her through the difficult cases." Colleen nodded enthusiastically. "There's such a need for women who understand birthing, especially in places where doctors are scarce. You could build a reputation quickly if you're willing to travel to help families in outlying areas." Margaret felt excitement bubble up in her chest at the thought of establishing herself professionally in their new home. "I'd like that very much. I've assisted with dozens of births over the years, and I find the work deeply satisfying." "Sam's a lucky man," Patrick observed with a grin. "Not every fellow gets a wife who can help bring new life into the world and manage a household with equal skill." Samuel's arm tightened around Margaret's shoulders where they sat on a fallen log, serving as their bench. "I'm well aware of how fortunate I am," he replied, his voice warm with genuine affection. Margaret leaned into her husband's warmth, marveling at how natural it felt to be part of a couple, to have someone claim her publicly as his partner and prize. The casual intimacy of married life sharing blankets at night, consulting each other about decisions, presenting a united front to the world felt like putting on clothes that had been tailored specifically for her body. The weather held fair until their 8th day on the trail, when a late-season storm swept across the plains with frightening intensity. The wagons were forced to shelter for nearly 24 hours in a grove of cottonwood trees, while wind howled and rain turned the prairie into a muddy morass. Margaret and Samuel huddled together under their canvas wagon cover, listening to the storm rage around them while trying to keep their supplies dry. "Are you regretting this adventure yet?" Samuel asked softly, his arm wrapped protectively around her as she shivered against his side. "Not for a moment," Margaret replied truthfully. "Even if we were struck by lightning right now, I wouldn't regret choosing to be here with you rather than sitting safely in my cottage, wondering what might have been." Samuel's lips found hers in the dim confines of their makeshift shelter, and Margaret marveled at how kissing her husband still sent thrills through her body, like a young girl experiencing her first romance. Their physical relationship had progressed carefully but steadily since their wedding night, Samuel's patient tenderness teaching Margaret that passion was not limited to the young or inexperienced. When the storm finally passed and they resumed their journey, Margaret felt as if she had passed some kind of test. She had faced discomfort, uncertainty, and genuine danger without falling apart or demanding to return to safety. The woman who climbed back onto the wagon bench was someone she barely recognized, confident, resilient, ready for whatever challenges Texas might present. Abilene appeared on the horizon like a mirage after 11 days of travel, its buildings shimmering in the afternoon heat despite the November chill. The town was larger than Margaret had expected, with several streets of businesses, 2 churches, a schoolhouse, and dozens of homes in various stages of construction. The railroad had reached Abilene just 2 years earlier, bringing an influx of settlers and commerce that had transformed it from a sleepy cattle stop into a booming frontier community. "It's not as rough as I feared," Margaret admitted as their wagon rolled down the main street past the hotel, general store, and bank. "Wait until Saturday night when the trail hands get paid," Samuel replied with amusement. "But the growing families and business owners want respectability more than they want excitement. There's opportunity here for people willing to work hard and contribute to the community." The ranch where Samuel would serve as manager lay 5 miles outside of town, accessible by a well-maintained road that suggested prosperity and careful planning. The Triple Bar Ranch encompassed nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, with good water sources and natural windbreaks that would protect cattle through harsh winters. The ranch house itself was a pleasant surprise, a 2-story structure, built from local limestone with wide porches and large windows that would provide excellent natural light. It was far more substantial than the cabin Margaret had expected, clearly designed to house a family rather than just shelter a hired hand. The previous manager left when his wife inherited property in Colorado, Samuel explained as they toured the empty house. "The owner, Mr. Harrison, lives in Dallas and wants someone reliable to run the operation independently. We'll have free rein to manage things as we see fit, as long as the cattle prosper and the profits remain steady." Margaret moved through the rooms, imagining how she might arrange furniture and organize the space. The kitchen was modern and well-equipped, with a new cast-iron stove and ample workspace for cooking large meals. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms offered space for guests, or perhaps the children she had never thought to have but found herself tentatively hoping might still be possible. "What do you think?" Samuel asked, finding her standing at the bedroom window that faced east toward town. "I think it's perfect," Margaret replied honestly. "I can imagine being very happy here." Their first weeks in Abilene passed in a blur of activity as they established themselves in the community and learned the routines of ranch management. Samuel threw himself into understanding the cattle operation with the focused intensity Margaret had come to recognize as characteristic of his approach to important challenges. He spent long days riding the range with the hands, assessing the condition of the herds and identifying areas that needed improvement. Margaret divided her time between setting up their household and making herself known to the women of Abilene. She attended church services at the Methodist Chapel, joined the Ladies' Auxiliary that organized charity drives and community events, and quietly let it be known that she had extensive experience with herbal medicine and midwifery. Her first professional call came just 3 weeks after their arrival, when Emma Patterson went into premature labor with twins. The town's only doctor was away treating victims of a mining accident, leaving Emma's frightened husband to seek help wherever he could find it. Margaret arrived at the Patterson cabin to find Emma weak from blood loss and the baby showing signs of distress. "Can you help them?" Henry Patterson asked desperately, his young face gray with fear. "I can try," Margaret replied calmly, already assessing the situation and forming a plan of action. "But I'll need hot water, clean linens, and absolute quiet while I work." The next 4 hours tested every skill Margaret had learned during her years of assisting Dr. Hayes. The twins were small but determined to live, and through careful positioning and patient encouragement, she managed to deliver both babies safely. When their lusty cries finally filled the cabin, Henry Patterson broke down in tears of relief and gratitude. "How can I ever repay you?" he asked as Margaret cleaned and examined the healthy baby boys. "By telling other families that help is available when they need it," Margaret replied simply. "And by taking excellent care of your wife and sons." Word of Margaret's success with the Patterson twins spread quickly through Abilene's close-knit community. Within a month, she was being called to assist with births throughout the area, sometimes riding for hours to reach isolated homesteads where women faced labor without any medical support. Samuel constructed a special medical bag for her, equipped with the herbs and instruments she needed to handle most birthing complications. "You're becoming quite famous," Samuel observed one evening as Margaret returned from assisting with her 8th successful delivery since their arrival. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store told me that women are planning their pregnancies around your availability." Margaret laughed as she settled into the rocking chair Samuel had purchased for her comfort after long days of travel. "That's probably an exaggeration, but I am grateful for the work. There's nothing quite like helping bring new life into the world safely. And nothing quite like knowing you're essential to this community's well-being," Samuel added, beginning to massage her tired shoulders with strong, gentle hands. "You've found your calling, Margaret McKinnon." The use of her married name still sent a thrill through Margaret, especially when Samuel said it with such obvious pride and affection. She had become someone entirely new in Texas, not the forgotten spinster of Cottonwood Falls, but a respected healer and valued community member. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes felt as if her previous life had belonged to someone else entirely. Their marriage had deepened during these months of building a new life together. Samuel's respect for her professional abilities matched his physical desire, creating a partnership that satisfied Margaret on every level. They worked together during the day when ranch duties allowed, shared meals and conversation in the evenings, and came together in their bedroom with a passion that made Margaret grateful she had waited so long to experience true intimacy. "I never knew it could be like this," Margaret confessed one night as they lay entwined in their large feather bed, her head resting on Samuel's chest while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "What could be like what?" Samuel murmured, his voice drowsy with satisfaction. "Marriage, love, this feeling of being completely known and accepted by another person." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "I feel the same way. Like I was only half alive before I found you." As winter deepened and Margaret's reputation as a midwife grew, she began to consider expanding her practice to include more general healing. The nearest doctor lived 30 miles away in Salina, leaving Abilene's residents to treat most ailments themselves or travel significant distances for medical care. Margaret's knowledge of herbal remedies and her calm presence during medical crises made her a natural choice for families seeking help with illnesses and injuries. "What would you think about my taking on more general healing work?" Margaret asked Samuel one evening as they planned their spring garden. "Nothing that would require surgery or advanced medical training, but the kinds of ailments that respond well to herbal treatments and common-sense care." Samuel looked up from the seed catalog they were examining, his green eyes bright with interest. "I think it's an excellent idea. This community needs someone with your skills and knowledge. Have you considered what you would charge for such services?" "I was thinking more in terms of barter than cash payment," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "Many families have more goods than money, and we could use extra vegetables, preserved foods, and handmade items." "Spoken like a true frontier entrepreneur," Samuel said with a grin. "You're going to build quite an empire of healing and hospitality if you keep expanding at this rate." Margaret felt a flush of pride at his confidence in her abilities. The woman who had once believed herself too old and set in her ways to change, had become someone who embraced new challenges and opportunities. The transformation still amazed her, but she was beginning to accept that perhaps she had simply needed the right circumstances to reveal capabilities that had always existed within her. Spring arrived early in Kansas, bringing with it a steady stream of new settlers and the inevitable medical challenges that accompanied frontier life. Margaret found herself busier than ever, traveling to assist with births, treating childhood illnesses, and helping families cope with the accidents and injuries that were common in agricultural communities. One particularly memorable case involved the Morrison family, no relation to their former neighbors in Cottonwood Falls, whose youngest daughter had suffered a severe burn from a cooking accident. Margaret spent 3 days at their homestead, applying honey and aloe treatments while monitoring the child for signs of infection. When little Sarah Morrison recovered completely without scarring, her parents insisted on spreading word of Margaret's skill throughout the surrounding counties. "You saved our daughter's life," Tom Morrison said simply when Margaret finally prepared to return home. "If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, you have only to ask." Such testimonials became increasingly common as Margaret's reputation spread beyond Abilene itself. Families traveled from as far as 50 miles away to seek her help with difficult pregnancies or chronic ailments that had resisted other treatments. Samuel often accompanied her on longer journeys, serving as both protector and assistant while she worked. "We make a good team," Margaret observed one evening as they returned from a 3-day trip to help deliver quadruplets to a rancher's wife near Ellsworth. "I never imagined having a husband who could be such an effective partner in my work. I never imagined having a wife whose work was so important to so many people," Samuel replied. "Watching you save lives and ease suffering, it makes me proud to be your husband in ways I couldn't have anticipated." As their first year in Texas drew to a close, Margaret realized that she had found something she had never dared to hope for, not just love and companionship, but genuine purpose and recognition for her contributions to the world. The woman who had once believed herself forgotten and useless had become someone essential to an entire community's well-being. The transformation seemed almost too remarkable to be real, but every day brought new evidence of its truth. Margaret McKinnon was no longer the spinster who grew too many tomatoes in the isolation of rural Kansas. She was a healer, a wife, a valued member of a thriving community, and a woman who had finally discovered that age was no barrier to reinventing one's entire life. Standing on the porch of their ranch house one evening, watching the sun set over the vast Texas sky while Samuel worked with the horses in the corral below, Margaret felt a contentment so complete it took her breath away. She had chosen love over fear, adventure over safety, possibility over resignation, and the rewards had exceeded her wildest dreams. The future stretched ahead like an endless prairie, full of opportunities she was only beginning to imagine. 2 years had passed since Margaret and Samuel's arrival in Abilene, and their lives had settled into a rhythm of purpose and contentment that neither had dared to imagine during those uncertain early days in Kansas. The Triple Bar Ranch flourished under Samuel's careful management, with cattle herds that had doubled in size and a reputation for quality that extended throughout Texas. Margaret's practice as a midwife and healer had grown beyond anything she could have envisioned, making her one of the most respected women in 3 counties. On a warm May morning in 1889, Margaret stood in her herb garden behind the ranch house, carefully harvesting chamomile flowers for the tinctures that had become one of her most requested remedies. The garden itself was a testament to her success. Neat rows of medicinal plants, arranged with the precision of a pharmacy, each variety carefully chosen for its healing properties, and labeled with wooden markers that Samuel had carved by hand. Cherokee purple tomatoes dominated one corner of the space, their vines heavy with fruit that carried the genetic memory of generations. Margaret had saved seeds each year, sharing them with other gardeners throughout the area and creating a network of growers who helped preserve the heirloom variety. The tomatoes had become something of a local legend, with people traveling considerable distances to obtain seeds from Mrs. McKinnon's miracle tomatoes. "Margaret!" Samuel's voice called from the direction of the barn, carrying a note of urgency that made her look up immediately. She could see him striding toward the house, his face animated with excitement about something. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her gathering basket and moving to meet him. "Letter from Dr. Hayes," Samuel replied, waving an envelope in the air. "He's written from San Francisco, where he's been working at a women's hospital. Margaret, you're not going to believe what he's proposing." Margaret accepted the letter with curious hands, noting the official letterhead of the California Women's Medical College. Dr. Hayes had indeed moved west the previous year, following through on the plans he had mentioned at their wedding. His letters had been filled with descriptions of the progressive medical practices he was witnessing and the opportunities for women in healthcare that were emerging in the more liberal Western territories. "Dear Margaret and Samuel," she read aloud, "I hope this letter finds you both in excellent health and spirits. Your latest reports about the success of your respective endeavors fill me with enormous pride and satisfaction. I always knew that Texas would benefit from your combined talents." She paused, scanning ahead to the portion that had excited Samuel. "I am writing to extend an extraordinary invitation. The California Women's Medical College has received a substantial endowment to establish training programs for rural midwives and healers. The college is seeking experienced practitioners who can serve as instructors and mentors for women seeking to formalize their medical knowledge." Margaret's heart began to race as she continued reading. "Your reputation has reached us even here in San Francisco. Margaret, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell herself has reviewed the testimonials I provided regarding your work, and she is eager to meet you. The college would like to invite you to participate in a 6-week summer program where you would both learn advanced techniques and share your own expertise with other women practitioners." 6 weeks in San Francisco, Margaret murmured, hardly able to believe what she was reading. To study at a medical college. "There's more," Samuel said, his eyes dancing with excitement. "Read the rest." Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The program would include formal certification as a professional midwife and herbalist, credentials that would allow you to practice legally in any state or territory. Additionally, the college has expressed interest in documenting your herbal remedies for publication in their medical journal. Your knowledge of traditional healing methods combined with your practical experience makes you exactly the type of practitioner we hope to elevate and celebrate. The letter concluded with practical details about travel arrangements and compensation. The college would pay all expenses, plus a generous stipend for her time and expertise. Margaret would not be attending as a student seeking charity, but as a recognized professional being honored for her contributions to the field of women's medicine. "Samuel," Margaret said slowly, "this is incredible. They want to learn from me, not just teach me. They're treating me as an expert in my own right." "Because that's exactly what you are," Samuel replied, his voice warm with pride. "You've delivered over 50 babies without losing a single mother or child. You've treated everything from snake bites to scarlet fever with remedies you developed yourself. Dr. Blackwell recognizes talent when she sees it, and she sees it in you." Margaret felt tears of joy and amazement prick at the corners of her eyes. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to receive a medical degree in America, a pioneer who had opened doors for every woman who sought to practice medicine professionally. The idea that such a distinguished figure knew of Margaret's work and wanted to meet her seemed almost too wonderful to be true. "But what about my practice here?" Margaret asked, practical concerns reasserting themselves. "I have women depending on me. Babies due throughout the summer. I can't simply abandon my responsibilities." Samuel had clearly anticipated this objection. I've already spoken with Dr. Peterson in Salina. He's been looking for an excuse to establish a satellite practice in Abilene, and he could cover your cases during your absence. It would actually help the community to have more regular medical coverage. Margaret looked at her husband with renewed admiration for his thoughtfulness and planning. You've already worked out the details. I want you to have every opportunity to grow and be recognized for your abilities, Samuel said simply. This chance may never come again, and you deserve to be celebrated by the medical establishment. The decision to accept the college's invitation required careful preparation and considerable courage. Margaret had never traveled further from Texas than their original journey from Kansas, and San Francisco seemed as distant and exotic as a foreign country. But the opportunity to learn advanced techniques, share her knowledge with other practitioners, and receive formal recognition for her work was too valuable to refuse. Samuel proved to be an enthusiastic supporter of her plans, helping her document her herbal remedies and organize the case studies that would form the basis of her presentations to the college. Together, they created detailed records of her most successful treatments, complete with drawings of the plants she used and precise descriptions of preparation methods. Your grandmother would be so proud, Samuel observed one evening as they worked together on organizing Margaret's notes. All that knowledge she passed down to you is going to help train a new generation of healers. Margaret felt a deep sense of connection to the generations of women who had come before her, whose wisdom was preserved in the remedies and techniques she now practiced. The thought that her knowledge might help other women serve their communities gave her work a significance that extended far beyond her individual achievements. The journey to San Francisco in July of 1889 was an adventure that surpassed even their original move to Texas. Margaret traveled by train for the first time in her life, marveling at the speed and comfort of railroad transportation. The landscape changed dramatically as they crossed from the flat plains of Texas through the mountains of Colorado and the deserts of Nevada before finally reaching the green hills of California. San Francisco itself was a revelation, a cosmopolitan city unlike anything Margaret had experienced, with cable cars climbing steep hills and a harbor filled with ships from around the world. The California Women's Medical College occupied a handsome brick building in the heart of the city, its modern facilities and well-equipped laboratories representing the cutting edge of medical education. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell proved to be everything Margaret had hoped: brilliant, progressive, and deeply committed to advancing opportunities for women in medicine. At 68, she possessed an energy and intellectual curiosity that inspired everyone around her. When she and Margaret first met, Dr. Blackwell grasped both of Margaret's hands and smiled warmly. "My dear Mrs. McKinnon," she said, "Dr. Hayes has told me remarkable things about your work. We are honored to have someone of your experience and wisdom join our program." The 6 weeks that followed challenged and inspired Margaret in ways she had never anticipated. She learned advanced obstetric techniques, studied the latest research in herbal medicine, and participated in discussions about the future of women's healthcare that opened her mind to possibilities she had never considered. More importantly, she discovered that her own knowledge was valued by her fellow participants, experienced midwives and healers from throughout the Western territories who had gathered to share their expertise. Margaret's presentations on herbal remedies and her case studies of difficult births were received with enthusiasm and respect by women who understood the challenges of practicing medicine in remote areas without formal support. "You've documented treatments that could save countless lives," observed Dr. Sarah McKinney, one of the first African-American women physicians in the country. "Your systematic approach to herbal medicine rivals anything being taught in formal medical schools." The validation from such accomplished women gave Margaret a new understanding of her own worth and capabilities. She was not simply a country midwife who had gotten lucky. She was a skilled medical practitioner whose knowledge and experience were genuinely valuable to the broader medical community. During her time in San Francisco, Margaret also formed friendships with women from diverse backgrounds who shared her passion for healing. Dr. Mary Austin from Oregon specialized in treating mining injuries, while Maria Santos from New Mexico had developed innovative techniques for delivering babies. In high-altitude environments, these connections created a network of professional colleagues that would support and inspire Margaret for years to come. The college's documentation of Margaret's herbal remedies resulted in a comprehensive article published in the American Journal of Women's Medicine, titled Traditional Healing Wisdom, Herbal Remedies from the Texas Frontier. Seeing her name in print as a recognized medical authority was a moment of triumph that Margaret treasured above any other recognition she had ever received. When she returned to Texas in August, Margaret brought with her not only advanced medical knowledge but also a formal certificate recognizing her as a certified professional midwife and herbalist. The credentials opened new doors for her practice, allowing her to charge professional fees and gain referrals from physicians throughout the region. Samuel met her train in Abilene with a bouquet of Cherokee purple tomatoes from their garden, a gesture that made Margaret laugh with pure joy. "Welcome home, Dr. McKinnon," he said with a grin that lit up his entire face. "Not quite a doctor," Margaret corrected, "but close enough for our purposes." Their reunion was passionate and tender. Two people who had grown individually during their separation, but whose love had only deepened with time and distance. Margaret marveled at how completely she trusted Samuel, how natural it felt to share her triumphs and struggles with someone who celebrated her successes without reservation. The years that followed were the most fulfilling of Margaret's life. Her practice continued to expand, drawing patients from throughout Texas and neighboring states. The formal credentials from California gave her work new legitimacy, allowing her to collaborate with physicians as a respected colleague rather than merely a folk healer. Samuel's success with the ranch paralleled Margaret's professional achievements. He eventually purchased the Triple Bar from its absentee owner, becoming one of the most prosperous ranchers in the region. Their combined success made them influential figures in Abilene's development, with Margaret serving on the hospital board and Samuel helping to establish the town's first bank. But perhaps their greatest joy was the discovery, in the spring of 1891, that Margaret was pregnant at the age of 55. The pregnancy was challenging and required careful monitoring, but Margaret's medical knowledge and Samuel's devoted care carried her safely through the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth, named for Dr. Blackwell. "I never thought I'd have children," Margaret whispered as she held her newborn daughter for the first time, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features that seemed like a miracle. After so many years of believing motherhood was beyond her reach. "I never thought I'd have a family at all," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at his wife and daughter. "You've given me everything I never dared to dream of wanting." Elizabeth McKinnon grew up surrounded by love and purpose, helping in her mother's practice from an early age and learning about healing herbs and birthing techniques as other children learned nursery rhymes. She would eventually follow her mother's path into medicine, becoming one of the first women to graduate from the University of Texas Medical School. As Margaret entered her 60s, she began to step back from the most demanding aspects of her practice, focusing on training younger women who could carry on her work. The network of midwives and healers she had helped establish throughout Texas ensured that her knowledge would not be lost, but would continue to serve communities for generations to come. On a warm evening in the spring of 1899, Margaret and Samuel sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their 8-year-old daughter play in the garden while the sun set over the vast Texas sky. Margaret was 59, Samuel 41, and their love had only grown stronger and deeper with each passing year. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked a question that had occasionally surfaced during their decade together. "Choosing me instead of someone younger who could have given you more years together." Samuel reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Margaret, you gave me a life worth living. You gave me purpose, partnership, and love beyond anything I thought possible. Every day with you has been worth a lifetime with anyone else." Margaret squeezed his hand, marveling at the journey that had brought them from that first meeting in her Kansas garden to this moment of complete contentment. She thought about the young woman she had been, afraid and isolated, convinced that her best years were behind her. She thought about the older woman she had become, confident and accomplished, surrounded by love and respect. "Age means nothing to love," she murmured, remembering the words Samuel had spoken during their courtship that had changed everything for both of them. "Nothing at all," Samuel agreed, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret reflected on the legacy they had built together, not just their successful businesses or their beautiful daughter, but the proof they had provided that love could triumph over convention, that courage could overcome fear, and that it was never too late to begin the life you were meant to live. Their story had become legend in Abilene and the surrounding communities, inspiring other couples to follow their hearts regardless of age or circumstance. Margaret's success as a healer had opened doors for other women seeking to practice medicine professionally, while Samuel's quiet strength and unwavering support had redefined what it meant to be a husband and partner. But perhaps most importantly, they had shown that love, real, transformative, life-changing love, could arrive at any age for those brave enough to recognize it and strong enough to fight for it. The spinster who had been forgotten by the world had found her place as a woman remembered and celebrated by everyone whose life she had touched. As they rose to go inside and tucked their daughter into bed, Margaret looked back at the garden where Cherokee purple tomatoes grew in neat rows, their seeds carrying the genetic memory of generations past and the promise of harvests yet to come. Like love itself, the best things in life were worth preserving, nurturing, and passing on to those who would come after. The woman who had once believed herself too old for new beginnings had discovered that every ending was simply preparation for a new and better story to begin. And in the comfortable warmth of Samuel's arms, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and deeply loved, Margaret McKinnon knew that her story was the most beautiful one she could ever have written. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.